Some of my best memories as a teenager were of camping with my best friend and his folks. For the sake of both context and brevity, I didn't have a great home life, and his parents were happy to take an astray for as many days out of the week as I could stay away without my mom coming looking. I'd spend more or less my whole summer with them, stopping home to do laundry and what chores I needed to keep from catching a beating for not pulling my weight, as my parents put it. So when summer started coming to a close, my friend, let's call him Mike, and his folks would head up on to one of their favorite off-the-beaten-path campsite in the middle of nowhere in Michigan. After having spent around 4 or 5 days at Mike's a week and getting my own mattress on the floor of his room, they invited me up with them to pitch a tent and watch a meteor shower away from all the city light. Naturally, I was thrilled. The first few trips were great. Mike's dad teaching me how to fish, riding down the river in tubes, hiking the trails and hot dogs over the fire. But every trip we saw something just a little off. Something that kept Mike and I quiet between the fire when his sister and her boyfriend shared ghost stories. It started with fairly innocuous occurrences, like finding a child's shoe caught in the weeds by the river, with a rusty old hatchet stuck in a nearby tree, or hearing our footsteps echoed through an empty part of the forest when we went off looking for morels. Stuff we could shake off as just a simple coincidence or imagination. I think it was my third trip with them that things started getting harder to explain away. It was getting to be about dusk, and Mike's dad suggested we should go out looking for some more branches to bolster our wood pile before it gets too dark. So we headed down the path to the place Mike called the Witch's Cauldron, a 50-foot wide gravel pit that looked like a proper crater with the forested hills climbing 40 feet up around most of it. We made our way up on one side and back under the trees, me grabbing branches off the ground and Mike whirling a stout little stick tied to a length of rope, searching for dead branches higher up that he could yank down. After 20 or so minutes of this, we flipped on our flashlights and started our walk back through the now shadowed wood, when we heard what sounded like a tree being felled nearby. This obviously scared the shit out of us. We picked up the pace a little after tossing insults back and forth for being jumpy, when we heard it again, closer. Mike said it might be an elk redding or something, but we stepped quicker still, until we heard a branch snap in front of us. We stopped, sweeping our lights in front of us, and caught a pair of eyes about 30 feet in front of us between some trees. All I could manage to notice before we took off sprinting was how high they were off the ground, taller than a bear standing, and too big besides. We made it back, panting, no wood in hand, babbling about seeing something with eyes the size of baseballs and antlers 10 feet up. His dad telling us it was probably an elk, and the shadows playing tricks on us. We ate the fish we caught earlier, happy enough no one wanted to talk about whatever it was we might have seen, and ready to head home. Over the next year it became a joke between us, the woodsman coming to take back his kindling and maybe you for dinner. We convinced ourselves it was nothing. But by our next trip early the following summer, we decided to steer clear of that patch of the forest. After spending a morning trying to catch some crawfish, but only finding a handful, we head down a trail leading up a ridge overlooking the river. We wandered off the trail just a bit, with Mike's assurance that he knows these woods. After all, he's come here nearly every year since he was 6. After a little while, I noticed the trail is gone. It was only a little ways behind us, but I could see it just a minute ago. Mike tells me to stop being a bitch. He knows where we are, no need to worry. I pushed down the sudden spike of fear, remembering all too well what we couldn't quite see last time. I tell him that we're lost. No, we're not, just follow me. Are you sure? Shut up, yeah. And on for the next few minutes. He tells me the path is just back there past these trees, so I asked, okay, then why are you breathing so hard? Then he stopped. I'm not, he said. Shh. Sure enough, he heard panting too, and motioned me to stay still and quiet while he reached for his Bowie knife his dad gave him for Christmas that year. The panting got quieter. Then a twig snapped, and with it the last of our courage. We sprinted towards where Mike said the path was and nearly took down his dad and the tents once we cleared the trees. How did we end up back at our campsite on the other side of the river? I yell at him that we were lost, and he's an asshole. He points out that there's only one bridge and we didn't cross the river. We spent the next day by our tent, not at all eager to go wandering off. Headed into town for dinner and then home the following morning. A few months later, his parents decided to take another trip back to the campground to watch a meteor shower. Naturally, I don't want fucking anything to do with those woods, but want less to do with my parents fighting and taking out their frustration on me. And I didn't want Mike wandering out there alone, I told myself. He tells me we're gonna find out what's going on out there. I say I'd rather not and just have a nice trip. Oh well. We made camp later than usual, delayed because of the traffic heading north, so we decided against taking the hike to the tallest hill to watch the shower. Late that night, Mike woke me up, asking if I heard whispers. I tell him to fuck off and that's not funny. It's probably your sister and her boyfriend making out or something. He shoves a piece of quartz into my hand, explaining that his sister used to date this new agey fella who fancied himself a warlock, and that it's supposed to be a protective crystal or something. I say whatever and that we should go back to sleep. The next day, his parents ask if we want to tackle a trail. Mike says we were going to go looking for firewood and fish for a bit. They take off, and Mike shoves that stupid piece of quartz back into my hand. Hold on to it, he says. We head back to the same trail we took last time. He points out that the trail is the only way back to our site. We couldn't have just got turned around. I say we should head back, but he keeps on and I follow. We get to a fork in the path neither of us remember, one side continuing more or less along the ridge, the other overgrown and winding deeper into the wood. Of course, he wants to follow that one. We stumble through the brush with him telling me that this is pointless and not even a trail. He smugly pulls aside a fern to show the waist-higher trail marker. We kept on until we heard what sounded like drums coming from up ahead. I asked him if he heard it too and got a quick nod, and quicker pace in response. We crested another low hill. The drumming got louder, and I asked how far we walked, because I couldn't hear the river anymore, that it should just be past these trees on our left. He just shrugs. The drums pound away. We reach the bottom of the hill and Mike yells, "Holy shit!" I turn around to see what he's shouting about. Just off the path on our right is some sort of carved tree, like a totem with weird faces on it and a crow nailed into one's eye. The drum stopped. Fuck this. We're turning back right now. He opened his mouth and a second later I heard an okay. We stare at each other. Did that just happen? I tried to say, but cut off with nothing, left my mouth until a few moments later. Like an echo. I turn around to head back and something giggles. Waist-high shadows dart through the brush just off the path. The giggles get louder and we start running in what feels like slow motion. The shadows follow us. We made it to the top of the hill and the panic really sets in. The path is gone. I look around frantically and Mike grabs me and points me back to where we came from. The totem thing is gone, replaced by glowing red spots, like eyes. Dozens of fucking eyes. We picked a direction and ran. It didn't matter where, just not here. I tripped over a log and let out a "fuck me." Mike pulls up. We're back at the start of the trail. Scrambling back down the ridge path, I gave the start. It felt like I was holding a hot coal. In our panic, I forgot about the quartz I was holding. I open my hands and find a now blackened crystal. He just stares at me and pulls out his. The same. We toss them into the woods behind and run to camp. We spent the rest of the day silent, ignoring his sister asking us what our problem is. His parents came back and said we were going to take the car up a little 2-track trail they found into a nearby hill and watch the shower. I stared at the sky for an hour or two, just trying to forget the strangeness of that afternoon. We hear a tree fall in the distance, then another. We all looked off to see what was happening. Then, a tall pine at the edge of the clearing lit up, like it was painted in gold on a black canvas, the light seeming to come from the tree itself. His dad takes a lamp to investigate, despite our pleas to head back. After 15 excruciating minutes of waiting, he walks back and announces we're heading back. Mike asks if he saw anything. Nothing worth mentioning, he tells us. We didn't bother with getting the fire started again and head to bed. The next morning, Mike tells me he felt something was watching him and he couldn't sleep. We notice our rain flap untied on one side, and just outside of it 2 black crystals laying on the ground. Once we all had our coffee, his dad said to pack in, we're leaving early. Something about forgetting some work he had to do on Monday. We were just happy to go. When we got back to the house, Mike tells me that he kept the now black quartz, said he couldn't leave without at least some proof of something happening. Over the next few years, we drifted apart, me making more friends and finding safe harbor to stay away from home, him heading to church twice a week and joining the Marines. We forgot about the strangeness of those trips mostly, or at least stopped bringing it up, but his family never went back there. Last week, while mowing my lawn, I ran over a rock. It shot out the siding, gave me a finger-long gash on my ankle. I pick it up, and wouldn't you know, it's a blackened chunk of quartz. I threw it on the road on my way to work, but I still flinch whenever I hear a kid outside laugh. I was a summer camp counselor for 4 years. Our camp sits on 2,500 acres of beautiful green forest. Sat in the middle is a lake attached to our dam leading down to the creek. Every year, a staff of about 50 kids, aged 15 to roughly 23, will come together to live in the middle of nowhere for 3 months during the summer school break. Our camp has a rich story, celebrating our 70th anniversary in 2018. In the 1500s, the Iroquois-speaking peoples of the Susquehanna tribe, who was known for mining the soapstone in the Odd Quarry, inhabited the area where the camp was built, leaving pottery and ruins behind over the years. On site, we also have found burial mounds. We have 2 camp rangers living on property, settled at opposite ends of the reservation. They live in smaller houses with their families, working almost 16 hours a day. They know the property like the back of their hands and do all the maintenance of the trails, campsites, and infrastructure. Ranger Gary moved out onto the reservation in 2012 with his family. Having so much property available to explore, he decided to go down the creek on a trail that had been destroyed by a thunderstorm. After hiking about a mile into the forest, he stumbled across a small cave, the inside being covered with white quartz and soapstone. Ranger Gary had decided to take a piece of the crystals home with him, and this is when our troubles started to occur. The night after his hike, Ranger Gary went out for a quick cigarette, eager to get to sleep. As he was heading out his front door, he realized he left his lighter on the table next to the window that overlooks the front yard. There, he saw a figure, roughly 7 feet tall with a thin frame. The creature was ghostly white, almost translucent, with a short torso and arms and legs making up most of the creature's stature. It looked anything but human. The creature started to advance towards the house. Ranger Gary, having a young child, went to go grab his airsoft rifle. As Ranger Gary burst out the front door, the creature stopped dead in its pursuit towards the house. From 20 yards away, Ranger Gary finally got a good look. After taking in its grotesque appearance, Ranger Gary fired a shot towards his metal fire pit, creating a loud metallic bang. Immediately, the creature took off into the forest, running about 100 yards through the grass at an incomprehensible speed. About a week later, Ranger Gary returned to the quartz cave with his wife, but by then the structure had been brown and green, looking as if it had been weathered over many years. 3 years later, 2 staff members were doing a midnight tent crew. This is during the end of the summer when most of the staff is exhausted from the past 2.5 months of nonstop work and want to return home as soon as possible. Taking the red Ford F-350 flatbed down the ridgeline, the boys were picking up tents to take back to our storage building. With a large break in the distance of the campsites, they left to grab the tents and they passed by a large open field. As they were driving along, the back of the truck dipped suddenly, making the noise of a heavy weight being added. With the older boy driving and the younger boy in the passenger seat, the older boy froze. He quickly sped up the truck, now pushing 40 miles per hour. "Put your head down," the older boy shouted at his junior. Taking a sharp turn, the weight of the back of the truck was lifted, and something crashed into the woods nearby. The boys abandoned the task of picking up tents, leaving the ones they had so far in the bed of the truck. The staff site and living quarters is set up in 3 parts. Tents for the staff who are under 18, 4 cabins for the over 18 and female staff, and a common area that holds a fire ring, single lamp post, and a large army tent from Vietnam for a common area. As the boys sped into the parking lot, not bothering to shut the truck's doors or even park properly, running into the first cabin where the older boy lived, they locked the doors and windows. the older boy sat the younger boy down, who was now confused and crying in the small living room, and grabbed his sheath knife. That night, neither of them slept due to the scratching and banging on the front door to the cabin. Later, upon asking, the older boy described what had jumped into the truck, matching Ranger Gary's untold story perfectly. Another 3 years passed with no incident. Then the summer came, and it was spotted by multiple people and staff on site, sometimes lurking by the electrical box or even digging around in a fire pit. Eventually, we got so scared that no one was to walk alone at night. 2 staff members even sat up until everyone had gone to bed for at least 2 hours to make sure it didn't appear. We started lighting fires nightly, hoping to scare it away. At the end of the summer, the younger boy from 3 years prior was driving the same truck for our annual midnight tent crew. He left with another boy to drop tents off. As a few other staff and I continued to take down in full tents, we heard the screeching of tires and yelling in the distance. 5 minutes later, we were told to drive back to the staff site immediately. Having 5 people and only 3 seats in the car, we piled on top of each other after the boy driving said no one was to walk back. History repeated itself that night, and that night no one slept. Now, finally onto the past year. Again, 3 years since the last incident, and my final year at the summer camp. All hell broke loose. Midway through the summer, a group of 6 of us sat at a picnic table smoking cigarettes and drinking a beer. No one was drunk yet, and our aquatics director froze. Behind me, the same white figure peeked out of the trees and watched us. No one had noticed except for him. Suddenly, in the middle of his sentence, he let out an angry scream. This had taken us all for surprise since he yelled in my direction. I started to tell him off. He told me to shut up and ushered us all inside to explain what happened. Boys from the other cabin then started to explain that they had been hearing banging and scratching on the doors and windows. Sometimes it would just be a ruckus, and other times they would hear something wailing on the side of their cabin. Sighting began to ramp up again, and as the senior staff, we decided that there would be a curfew of 10 p.m. for all staff under 18. Everyone was to go to their tents. Instead of walking to the shower house, all staff should stay in staff site and use the cabin's bathrooms after that time. No midnight walks and no wandering into the woods. As the medic, I was the only person other than our aquatics director and administration leader allowed to leave the staff site unless an emergency arose. Even then, I always took one of my cabin mates with me, just in case. During our final week, the unthinkable happened. I was asleep in my bed, located near our cabin's front door. I awoke to the sound of our door opening. A few moments passed by after some noises in our kitchen, and then the door was slammed shut. After the assumption that it was one of the girls coming in from hanging out in another cabin, I checked my phone. It was about 2 a.m., and thankfully I didn't have any medical calls coming over my radio, so I decided to return to sleep. For the second time that night, I awoke to the sound around the cabin. This time, it was the sliding of the window above my bed. I looked up slowly, my heart beating out of my chest. What looked back at me was the white, frail creature. It had large sunken eyes, a flat nose, and thin lips. We stared at each other for what must have been a millisecond, but felt like minutes. In the blink of an eye, it ran back into the woods. I shut the window and slept with every knife I had that night, open and ready. The next morning, our kitchen had been ransacked, with snacks strewn across the floor and cabinets open. Furious about the mess, I asked who had come in at such a late time. All of my cabin mates denied staying out and confirmed that everyone had been in by 10 p.m. that night. The only explanation is whatever this creature was had gotten bolder and came into our home. Remember to listen and look at your surroundings. Don't remove anything from the forest. And be vigilant, working at my old summer camp. I tried telling other people. They feigned sympathy, but I know all they see is the grief-stricken ramblings of a mourning sibling. It's been a while since I sat down and wrote this much, but I figured it was important to get it out there. Maybe for closure, maybe to honor his memory. It doesn't matter. Let's get this over with. I've always been fond of the outdoors. I live for the cool air blowing through the trees, the crunch of the leaves beneath my feet, and the vast tapestry of stars spread out against the inky void. My brother, who I'll call Jay, was pretty much the exact opposite. Calling him a recluse would be an understatement. I don't think anybody ever actually saw him since he moved out of the house, and the most I heard from him was a monthly phone call. The very concept of the outdoors was anathema to him. He also had a debilitating fear of the dark. He'd often text my mom in the middle of the night, rambling about some horrific nightmare he'd had, and he still has his blanket from when he was a kid. Most people who hear about this laugh, assuming it's a simple phobia, but few understand the depths of his revulsion. This, along with a plethora of other reasons, was what finally led me to a decision. Jay would go camping with me, whether he liked it or not. I would come down there and drag him out the house if need be. I texted him. To my surprise, he agreed, as long as I picked him up from his house. Easy enough. I started up my old minivan and got onto the road. His house was nondescript, just another small one-bedroom flat in the sea of others exactly like it. I opened and unlocked the door and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the light. Every surface was washed with a glowing light that emanated from several searing white bulbs on the ceiling. Even the underside of the dinner table was lit with a high-power flashlight. The next thing was the filth. Piles of old clothes were strewn across the floor, and a thin layer of grease covered the kitchen. I slowly ascended the stairs to Jay's room. I didn't need to knock. It was as if he knew I was there, and he opened the door as soon as I reached the top of the stairs. He silently walked over to me. Already fairly creeped out, I decided to just get back in the car, which I did, Jay following me just behind. We drove silently. I asked him if I could put on some music, and he just nodded. The rest of the 8-hour drive was more of the same. When we got there, I was so excited I jumped out of the car. We set up our tents in silence. The silence I could tolerate, however, as it was punctuated by the gentle chirping of birds. The first day went by smoothly, until night fell. We roasted some marshmallows around the campfire, almost forgetting just how quiet it was, and went to bed at around 9 or 10. Jay seemed fine, and we were just in separate tents, so I didn't worry too much about it. Big mistake. As I usually do on camping trips, I woke up in the middle of the night and went outside to take in the ambient sounds. I looked up groggily and almost gasped. The stars were blinking out. One by one, the tiny points of light above me were disappearing, seemingly randomly. At first, it was too small to notice, but soon, patches of sky were entirely shrouded in darkness. I was about to pass it off as sleep-deprived hallucinations when I heard groaning coming from Jay's tent. I rushed inside and looked over to Jay's sleeping bag. He seemed to just be having a nightmare, but as I looked closer, I noticed tiny black spots near the corner of his mouth, like specks of tar. Then, all at once, a jet black liquid came rushing from every orifice on his face. I screamed with terror. I wanted to call 911, but my legs stayed frozen as more and more of that thick tar-like substance spurted from his eyes and mouth. As it touched his skin, it burned away flesh. So by the time it was done, all that remained was a large grayish stain on the sleeping bag. I was hyperventilating at this point. I had just watched my brother die in front of my eyes, and I had done nothing. I couldn't help it, and I started crying. Who could I tell? They won't believe me. They all pretend to understand, but I know they think I'm going insane. Maybe I am. Who knows at this point? I've started keeping the light on while I sleep. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and thank you for watching this video. Let me know what you thought down below. You can find each story link in my description box, so be sure to leave a comment and an upvote for the author. Be sure to stay tuned for more scary stories, and don't forget to email me if you have one you want to hear on my channel.